This episode is brought to you by CuriosityStream, a subscription streaming service that offers over 2,000 documentaries and non-fiction titles, unlimited access starting at just $2.99 a month, and 30 days for free if you sign up through the link below and use the code GEOGRAPHICS. More on them in a bit. It will be one of the biggest earthquakes in history. When the big one finally hits America's west coast, it will unleash carnage on a scale rarely seen. Buildings will collapse, burying thousands in rubble. Fires will break out, devastating entire city blocks. There will be landslides, dam failures, chemical spills, things that taken alone would qualify as one of the worst disasters this side of Hurricane Katrina. But taken all together, it will affect millions. And that's just for starters. Minutes after shaking begins, a vast tsunami will roll in, washing away coastal communities and inundating hundreds of thousands of square miles. By the time the wave recedes, North America will have witnessed its worst ever natural disaster. The culprit behind all this misery? Well, that would be the Cascadia megathrust fault, an offshore subduction zone capable of unleashing so much energy it'd make the fabled San Andreas Big One look like a mere wobble. But rather than being a hypothetical, this megaquake will soon become reality. Estimates for it happening in the next 50 years range from a worrying 1 in 10 to a terrifying 1 in 3. Today, we're exploring both the history of Cascadia and its apocalyptic future. The day before the wave came, there were no signs that anything was amiss. It had been a mostly clear afternoon across the islands. The sun was shining. The air was cold and crisp. Apart from a few cloud patches here and there, it was about as reasonably nice a day as you could hope to get in winter. Significantly, no one in the whole of Edo Period Japan had felt any tremors. There had been none of the earthquakes that so typified life within the Pacific Ring of Fire. That meant, as people went to bed that evening, they were completely unprepared for the disaster that would soon befall them. Shortly after midnight ticked over on the 8th day of the 12th month of the 12th year of the Genroku Era, or what we would call the 27th of January 1700 AD, the wave arrived. It came silently, and it came with no warning. End to end, it measured something in the region of 600 miles, but it wasn't the length of the tsunami that caused the problems, it was its height. At its peak, the water reached 16.5 feet. The worst struck area was the Miyako Bay area. In Kuwagasaki, 13 houses were washed away and fires started that claimed another 21 buildings. At Tsugarushi, the waters cascaded half a mile up the main street, destroying homes and nearly wiping out a shrine. All along the eastern coast, rice paddies were damaged, homes flooded, and goods destroyed in government storehouses. The most dramatic moment may have come at Tanabe, where the mayor watched in horror as the castle moat was breached. But even in lesser affected areas, people were still sent running for the hills. Yet once the waters had finally receded, it wasn't the damage that people focused on. It was that the wave had happened at all. Japanese records on the relationship between earthquakes and tsunamis go back to at least the 6th century. It's all part and parcel of surviving in one of the most seismically active countries in the world. But the 1700 tsunami had come without a tremor. It had simply appeared in the night, a god of death rearing out of the ocean like some totally dickish version of Poseidon. Had Edo Period Japan been less isolationist, they might have realized that they weren't the ones grappling with the misery. Some 4,600 miles away, the native tribes of North America were struggling to understand what they'd just seen. Roughly 10 hours before the orphan wave swept into Miyako Bay, the earth below the native people of America had shaken violently. It had transformed the landscape. Unlike the Japanese, though, the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest didn't keep written records. Instead, they recorded their histories orally, telling stories that encoded both legends and great events from the past. And the events of that night were, without doubt, some of the greatest that any of them had ever seen. The night Thunderbird attacked, she gave no warning. It was a dark and miserable evening, the sort of evening that's a basic feature of life when you live in the Pacific Northwest and it never seems to stop raining. In the midst of this gloom, Thunderbird suddenly swept down out of the night sky, vast invisible. She picked up her nemesis whale in her talons and hauled him into the night air. Far up in the night sky, she dropped him and the whale went slamming back to Earth. The force of his body shook the world. In the bay, the waters receded, pulled back into the ocean. The wisest ones saw what this would mean and got into their canoes. They were the ones who survived. After the battle came the flood. As the waters rolled back in, villages disappeared. People were swept away. Those who survived saw strange sights after, like canoes stranded in trees. The battle between Thunderbird and whale was felt all up and down the Pacific coast. For some who later told the stories, Thunderbird was the hero defeating the evil whale. For others, she was the evil one attacking an innocent whale. Yet others insisted that the battle took place not between Thunderbird and whale, but between Thunderbird and Transformer, one who created the world. But the mythic battle between these two great titans was only one explanation that arose for the shaking Earth and the flood that night, one mostly centered around modern Oregon. Further afield, vastly different indigenous tribes came up with vastly different tales. On Vancouver Island, the First Nations Huayat people told stories of dwarfs living in a giant mountain. That night, they invited a man to dance around their drum, but the man accidentally kicked the drum and its sound became trapped in his foot. From that moment on, wherever he walked, his every step created an earthquake. No sooner had he set foot outside the mountain than it caused a shaking and a flood that swept away whole villages. Down in Northern California, the Yurok people told a similar story. They claimed a being called Earthquake, who had large, heavy feet, was running up and down the coast. Every footstep caused the land to split open and the ocean to come flooding in. According to an oral history collected over 150 years later, the Yurok had all assembled on a big hill and performed a jumping dance to drive Earthquake away. But while it finally left, the devastation remained. When they descended the hill again, the Yurok had found everything they'd ever known was lost under a layer of water. The tale of the Tolowa people was even scarier. They focused not on Earthquake or even on shaking grounds, but on the waters that followed. Everyone the water touched was immediately turned into a mass of coiling snakes. The only Tolowa to survive were a teenage boy and a girl who managed to outrun the flood by climbing up a hill. When they came down 10 days later, the entire world had been swept clean and replaced with sand, and it was only their children that stopped the human race from going extinct. There are dozens more stories like this, and likely hundreds more that were lost to history, but they all have one thing in common. They are the only surviving accounts of what happened that night. What happened when the Cascadia megathrust fault unleashed its massive earthquake in 1700 just off the coast of the Pacific Northwest. Registering at least 9 on the Richter scale, and likely higher, it transformed the land from California to British Columbia and triggered the orphan wave that would so shock Edo Japan. Yet, while these stories would still be told well into the 20th century, no one would ever think to take them seriously as part of history. No one would ever assume they were anything more than just ancient legends. By the time modern scientists figured out the truth behind them, it would already be too late. Now that we've seen what the Cascadia subduction zone is capable of, at least in mythologized form, now would be a good time to discuss what it actually is. Like, where did it come from, and how the heck is it capable of generating earthquakes powerful enough to create their own myth cycles? The first part of that question is easy. Just off the west coast of the US, the vast North American tectonic plate comes into contact with the much smaller oceanic plains of Juan de Fuca. However, this is smaller on a relative scale. Juan de Fuca still measures 90,000 square miles. Plates like these are always on the move, grinding along and rearranging themselves over millions and millions of years, taking us from a world where you have supercontinents like Gondwana to one where you have the continents of today. In an ideal world, all this super slow moving would be accomplished smoothly. Tectonic plates would inch along over the centuries and we'd never even notice. But this isn't an ideal world, and in our less than ideal worlds, these plates often get a bit stuck. And when they get stuck, you get faults. And when you get faults, well, you get earthquakes. The most famous fault of all is probably the San Andreas fault in California. This fault is caused by two plates moving parallel in opposite directions. In this case, the North American and the Pacific plates, and, well, they get jammed against one another. When enough pressure builds, the plates finally snap forward, and that's what is called a strike-slip fault. But there are other types of fault out there that operate in wholly different and more dangerous ways, and Cascadia is one such fault. Off the coast of Oregon, the Juan de Fuca plate is trying its best to burrow its way underneath the North American plate, a process that is known as subduction. It should be sliding neatly underneath, but instead it's gotten stuck. As a result, the North American plate is compressing, the entire landmass getting squeezed by about 1.5 inches each year. As the plate compresses, pressure builds. When it finally gets too much for the Earth to bear, the plate will suddenly shift, and all that energy will be unleashed. The result? Well, let's just look at a list of famous earthquakes caused by subducting plates. Alaska, 1964. Death toll, 131. Chile, 1960. Death toll, up to 7,000. Japan, 2011. Death toll, over 18,000. In other words, the potential is there for the Cascadia quake to be one big mother. But that's only its potential. Although the fault runs between 600 and 700 miles all the way from Cape Mendocino, California to Vancouver Island, not all regions are equally active. The central zone is pretty quiet, almost silent. On the other hand, the northern and southern portions show constant activity. This is both interesting and somewhat relieving because faults don't necessarily let rip all at once. The most likely possibility for the next major Cascadia quake is that only the southern section, focused around North California, will go. In that case, the resulting quake would register around 8 or 8.6 on the Richter scale. Now, that's still big, about as big as the fabled San Andreas big one will be, but it's not an Armageddon-sized event. In modern history, the US has had at least 4 bigger quakes, although none of them took place outside Alaska. On the other hand, it's possible that the entire Cascadia fault could give way. Known as a full margin rupture, this could produce a quake with a magnitude of 9.2. Because the Richter scale is logarithmic, such a Cascadia megaquake would be around 30 times bigger than anything the San Andreas fault could possibly produce. It would be the joint biggest quake in US history, alongside the 1964 Alaska quake and the joint second biggest quake the world has ever seen. But the weird thing is that the Cascadia almost never produces minor quakes. If you live in the Pacific Northwest, chances are you've never felt even a middling 4.0 quake, the sort of quake that wakes you up wondering if your bedmate ate too many chili burritos the night before. This lack of serious quakes is almost the opposite of what you'd expect to happen along a subduction zone. And it's the reason no one discovered what Cascadia was capable of until the 1980s. By then, we'd already spent centuries building beside it some of the most earthquake-vulnerable towns in American history. And just before we get into what might happen to those towns, let me take a moment to tell you about today's fantastic sponsor, CuriosityStream. CuriosityStream is a subscription streaming service that offers over 2,000 documentaries and non-fiction titles from some of the world's best filmmakers, including exclusive originals. If you're enjoying this video, you should definitely check out some of their documentaries about natural disasters. They've got a whole bunch of them covering things from tsunamis, super relevant to today's video, to pandemics, less relevant but just as interesting. Just use the search function on their website and you will find all sorts of cool stuff. Just search tsunami or earthquake. You're going to get a bunch of hits. CuriosityStream is available on many platforms: web app, Roku, Android, Xbox One, smart TVs, iOS, Chromecast. The list really does go on. If you've got a device, CuriosityStream is probably going to work on there. You can get unlimited access starting at just $2.99 a month. And for you guys, the first 30 days are completely free if you sign up at curiositystream.com/geographics using the promo code geographics during the sign up process. It's a great way to support the show and keep us making more videos. And well, CuriosityStream, obviously, pretty great fit for the sort of content we make. And let's get back to the video. That we discovered Cascadia at all is down to pure dumb luck. When Lewis and Clark arrived in Oregon in 1805, it had already been over a century since the last full margin rupture in 1700. The land they found was peaceful, quiet, seemingly the ideal place to build settlements. Never mind all those persistent Native Americans and First Nation stories about the land getting all shaky. That was just a load of old buffalo dung, right? White settlers continued to think that all the way until the 20th century. Even when geologists identified the Cascadia subduction zone in the 1970s, everyone was all like, well, there's never been a serious quake in Oregon, must be a seismic fault. In fact, they were so sure that Cascadia was inactive that the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission began planning a slew of nuclear power plants in the region. Just before giving the green light, the commission decided to check with the US Geological Survey and make sure that the fault was as harmless as everyone assumed it was. The USGS came back with two possibilities. Possibility 1, Cascadia really was a super quiet fault, or possibility 2, it was a Chile-style fault. This made everyone immediately sit up and start paying attention. Chile is a big deal in the field of earthquakes because it's home to some of the worst on Earth. The largest quake in recorded history took place off the coast in 1960, killing up to 7,000 people. That quake, too, was caused by a subduction fault. If Cascadia really was like Chile, mostly quiet but occasionally apocalyptic, who knew what it might be capable of? Over the next few years, scientists began to seriously study the Pacific Northwest for signs of a previous megaquake. By 1984, they'd begun to find evidence of huge floods, landslides, and tsunamis, but not enough to actually declare Cascadia active. Finally, geologist Ruth Ludwin of the University of Washington hit upon an intriguing idea. There might be no written records of a pre-European quake in the region, but what about the native oral histories? So they checked West Coast tales for likely candidates, and what they found was terrifying. There were upwards of 40 myths spread across various tribes that all seemed to record a massive quake and tsunami. When those that could be dated were given an approximate range, it was found they all clustered around 1700. Clearly, something was going on. Over the next few years, more and more rigorous analysis was done, and more surveys were undertaken. At last, in 1996, scientists writing in Nature pieced together the last time Cascadia had unleashed the big one. At 9 p.m. on January the 26th, 1700, a 9.0 magnitude earthquake had struck the Pacific. Two impossibly big waves had formed, one rushing into America and drowning untold native tribes, the other whisking off toward Japan, where it would strike 10 hours later. But the worrying news didn't stop there. By analyzing deposits left by the tsunamis, other researchers were able to calculate how many times in history Cascadia had ruptured. The number they arrived at was 41 megaquakes over 10,000 years. That may sound like a long time, but when you average it out, you find it means only one rupture every 250-odd years. And no, your maths doesn't deceive you. 1700 plus 250 means we should have been expecting a quake since around 1950. In other words, we're now very much overdue for another Cascadia big one. So let's find out what will happen when it finally arrives. As we mentioned earlier, there are multiple ways that Cascadia could rupture from ah to ah. For simplicity's sake, this session is going to assume a more extreme scenario measuring 9.2 on the Richter scale. This, then, is how it might play out. The first thing you'll notice is that all the dogs are acting loopy. That's because the compression wave will have just hit, a sort of early warning system built into earthquakes, but one that only certain animals can detect. Sadly, humans aren't among those animals, so you'll just stand around thinking, alright, this is weird, the dogs are freaking out, but I mean, oh well. Enjoy those long seconds of confusion while they last, because it may well be the last time you ever enjoy anything again. Roughly 30 seconds after Fido starts going bananas, the seismic waves will hit. At first, it will be freaky, but then the shaking will last longer and longer and get more and more powerful, and it will go from worrying to actively life-threatening. Unlike California, the Pacific Northwest only brought in strict building codes in 1994. That means any structure built before the 90s will be in danger of immediate collapse. As the shaking increases, houses will start to fall on their occupants, schools will collapse, airports, fire stations. All told, it's thought that up to 1 million buildings in the region might fall down. 3,000 schools could collapse, along with 2/3 of all hospitals. Thousands will be crushed to death. Tens of thousands will be trapped in the rubble. And this is only the beginning. Gas lines rupture, fires will break out, the electrical grid will fail. Up to half of all highway bridges will fall down. Remember the awful bridge collapse in Italy in 2018 that traumatized the nation? Well, now imagine that scenario repeating not dozens, but hundreds of times from Northern California to British Columbia. Elsewhere, the quake will trigger deadly landslides, up to 30,000 of them in the Seattle area alone. Inland, dams will fail, causing floods. There will be chemical spills, gas leaks, explosions. By the time the shaking subsides, 6 minutes after the dogs started howling, the Pacific Northwest will be unrecognizable. Up to 75% of buildings will have been compromised. There will be a cascade of separate disasters to deal with, from fires to hazardous waste spills. In short, the aftermath of the quake will be miserable, but you'll have no time to stop and think about that. The moment the fault ruptured, the northwest edge of North America will have dropped 6 feet and rebounded up to 100 feet west. A lot of this movement will have happened under the ocean, creating a 600-mile-long wave out at sea that is now rushing toward the western seaboard. Those dazed minutes of horror after the ground stops moving will be your last chance to run. Believe me, running is exactly what you'll need to be doing. Bad as the quake itself will be, it will have nothing on what comes next. When the tsunami hits, everything will get a million times worse. When the Cascadia tsunami arrives, you'll have no trouble spotting it. At its lowest point, the water will reach a height of 20 feet. At its highest, it will crest over 100 feet. When it reaches the coast, it will be moving at 12 miles per hour, sweeping everything from boats to cars to human bodies along with it. At this point, our narrative branches into different parallel universes depending on when the quake strikes. If it happens in winter, then the maximum possible death toll is around 71,000, the number of people who live in the inundation zone. Since many of them will run for high grounds, the actual death toll will be far lower. But even in this better case scenario, it's still estimated that a third of the population will be too elderly or disabled to escape the wave. But if the quake hits during a summer holiday, let's say like the 4th of July weekend, we could be looking at carnage on an unprecedented scale. In Oregon alone, it's estimated over 150,000 people could be on the beaches, with another 17,000 at risk in Washington state. That's not even including those on Vancouver Island. Altogether, you could be looking at nearly 200,000 people right in the tsunami's path. Some would escape, but most wouldn't. As the seawater moves inland, over 100,000 square miles will be flooded out. Buildings that survive the quake will be swept away. Entire towns will drown. When the New Yorker interviewed FEMA Regional Director Kenneth Murphy in 2015 about the tsunami's aftermath, he cheerfully replied, "Our operating assumption is that everything west of Interstate 5 will be toast." For those not up on their US geography, this includes not just Seattle and Portland, but also Eugene, Salem, and up in Canada, Victoria, and Vancouver itself. About half an hour after the compression wave hit, the tsunami's onward march will end. By then, 7 million people will have been affected, and the Pacific Northwest annihilated. The statistics will be brutal. FEMA estimates that given a winter quake, some 13,000 people will be killed outright and another 27,000 injured, easily making it the worst natural disaster in US history. On top of that, up to 1 million people will have lost their homes and another 2.5 million will be in urgent need of food and fresh water. But this is just in winter. Were the wave to strike when Oregon's beaches are at their fullest in the middle of a hot public holiday in summer, then the death toll could skyrocket. At time of writing, the worst North American disaster on record is the 2010 Haiti quake, which killed between 100,000 and 160,000 people. Horrible as it is to say, a summer Cascadia quake could top even that. But before you go rushing to build an earthquake-proof shelter on the tallest hill you can find, just remember this probably won't happen in your lifetime. The odds of Cascadia unleashing its full might in the next 50 years are 1 in 10. That's about 10 times higher than we'd like it to be, but still on the lowish side. Much more likely is an 8.0 quake that's damaging, but with a death toll in the hundreds rather than the thousands. So yeah, realistically, Cascadia is probably not going to unleash hell on you. Still, just in case you do happen to live in that unfortunate 10% chance universe, there's something else you probably should know. We've been aware for a while that the Cascadia and San Andreas faults both connect, brushing together just offshore of Mendocino County. A couple of years ago, researchers decided to see if the two had any effect on one another. By dating the geological remains of previous San Andreas quakes and comparing them to the remains of Cascadia quakes, they were able to make an unsettling discovery. Over the past 3,000 years, a major Cascadia quake has caused the San Andreas fault to also rupture between 9 and 11 times. That means almost every time Cascadia unleashes the big one, it's followed by San Andreas, also bringing about the earthquake apocalypse. Just think, the sheer staggering death toll in this video may just be the beginning. Unaffected by Cascadia, LA and San Francisco could then be hammered by a devastating quake all on their own. Such a 1-2 punch would affect every single person living on the West Coast. It would cause chaos all the way from Canada to Mexico. And there's a little under a 1 in 10 chance of it happening by 2070. As this video ends, we'll leave you with the following thought. It's often said that we should live every day like it's our last. It's a somewhat trite saying, one that essentially means you should try and grasp opportunities and make the most of what you have. Well, if you live on the west coast of America, you might want to start taking it literally. Because if Cascadia goes off, it really will be the end. The end of everything that you've ever known. So I won't ask if you enjoyed that video, but I do hope you found it interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Also, please do support this show by supporting our fantastic sponsor, CuriosityStream. They're linked to below. And thank you for watching.